Today is November 25th, and this is the second interview with Mr. Edwin Olmstead. Mr. Olmstead, we have your permission to tape this interview.
You bet.
Okay. Now, from last time we met, we talked a lot about your bringing up in New York and your experiences in the war, working for your essential industry and coming to Cumberland County. I'd like to go back and if you could clarify some more about your father's influence at an early age, what it was like to have a father as a clergyman, to start out with.
Let me take the other topic first while I kind of think that one in the back of my mind.
Okay.
Father was just a simple country boy. He had two older sisters, quite a bit older, same as I. And he, on a little farm that basically there are quite a few other family members around. In fact, the area was locally, then called Olmstead Hill, almost on the New York-Pennsylvania line, just barely in here. The nearest community of any sort was Waverly, Nichols, New York.
Okay.
And I don't know what all activities he had. There weren't many things to play with or anything else, but essentially they were running a dairy farm, plus the sustenance is needed. And I don't know how big the cattle were, but his father was a cooper, and they churned most of their milk and sold it as butter in wooden firkins that my grandfather made. I don't know whether you know, firkin is kind of a half barrel. It's a wooden shape, hoop and stave construction, straight staves, and larger on the bottom than on the top. Okay. And grandfather had considerable skill at that. One of the things my father mentions is that when he finished his work, he always tested them with water, and many, many times the first time he put them together, there was no water leakage. So Dad, this is a matter of considerable skill, and Dad acquired some of that. He liked carpentry work, and obviously had a carpentry shop of sorts. I can't tell you about the age or the timing or any of that, but sometime fairly young, he acquired a Civil War musket and became interested in hunting. He always liked to hunt. Not everybody understands this. He obviously hunted alone. I don't know of anybody else hunting with him. And his prime target was woodchucks and crows. And hunt on the farm area and probably other people's farms around. And they certainly weren't using poisons such as they are now, and I'm sure that especially when they had a crop of alfalfa, the woodchucks were a nuisance and taking entirely too much of the crop. Beyond that, I don't know how long he did it. I think he did it probably as long as he was home. His pre-college education was in Owego, New York, a few miles from the farm, and he worked his way there by tending the fire in the schoolhouse. In fact, he'd lived there all week. His sister used to take him over by horseback, I think, on Monday morning. His mother always cooked him a huge plate of baked beans that he lived on all week, somehow or other. And when the weather was cold, he would tend the fires and live someplace there. I never heard what the details were of what sort of a dormitory room for go to school and study for some time. The building is still there, but it's a lawyer's offices now. I visited one time. And then he went to Syracuse in 1897 essentially on a shoestring. I haven't the slightest idea. Well, again, he earned his way somewhat by tending fires. And there were a number of houses of one sort and another. I don't think there were any fraternity houses, but just private homes, and maybe faculty members, but glad to have somebody come and keep their fires going for them, and furnace fires usually. And I graduated in there in 1901. I know shotguns he had. I don't know how he came by them, but only recently I sold one gun that he bought in 1913 that was a very special gun, and we had a letter while he was writing to Mother. He was away one time and very faithful in writing letters to her. We had one of those letters where he told of ordering the gun and anxiety waiting for it and so on. And one of the things that shocked him, he wanted them to leave out a dovetail for a sight he never intended to use. He never liked open sights. He, earlier than most, learned the virtue of peep sights, and he wanted them to leave a dovetail out for a rear sight, and they said they'd charge him $3 extra to do it, and he never understood why they wanted to charge him for omission of something. And I think the gun cost him $14. Then for a long time, a number of years, I don't know how many, but in his preaching career after 1904, he graduated from seminary and was married in 1904, and then I don't know how he made the contact, but he discovered a number of people that became lifelong friends around Springwater, New York. And he and other people, and I don't know who they were, but maybe parishioners, I don't know, would tent near Springwater on the hills of friends and spend their time hunting woodchucks and camping as well. I do know a friend of his in Mount Morris, New York, where I was born, had a hunting camp in the Adirondacks, and he went up there one year for deer season. So as early as I was able to, I thoroughly enjoyed going out and tromping the fields with him while he was hunting. As soon as I was old enough for a license, I did a little hunting too. I didn't shoot as many woodchucks as he did, though. That was almost exclusively woodchucks. The situation was the woodchucks were quite thick in that area. It was a poor day when he didn't get at least 8. And his record day was 32, and I haven't found anybody else with a taller story than that one. Mother used to accuse him of accuracy of count, but we couldn't really prove anything. And from that, I just acquired an interest and eventually inherited his guns and hunted with him for quite a while. They hunted with me down here 1 year, 2 years on South Mountain, and then one of his preacher friends had a place up on the Stony Creek, just in the Morris area, and we went up there several years together for the deer season. I also went up, took a New York license and hunted woodchucks up for my vacation several times.
So ever since you were of the age to go hunting, you've had an interest in it?
I did, yes. Eventually my interest switched more to the guns than it did to the hunting itself. Well, actually, I got this cat partly because of hunting. I was hunting on Bill Dodd's farm for woodchucks on occasion, but they were pretty thin. I was lucky if I got one or two in an afternoon. And of course, eventually, when I guess I accounted for the Civil War interest, and when I decided to specialize the way other people had, I don't know whether anybody's actually counted how many Civil War shoulder arm and handgun books there are. Their number is probably in the thousands, with almost nothing on the cannon. There was nothing that I consider any good at the time that Ripley and Hazlett were both working on theirs. And it was kind of fun to tie in with the two people who knew far more than I did and be their go-for, since I was traveling enough to visit a lot of places, and from that I defaulted into co-authorship.
I'm curious if your experience with guns and your father being a clergyman, if that was common for a clergyman to go hunting, or if it was common for a child such as yourself to have an interest in hunting at that age.
As for the clergyman, I can't say. The anti-gun movement, from my point of view, is something that has been growing enormously in the last 30 or 40 years. I never heard any criticism. And often there are parishioners that would go out with him. People just took it for granted that what you did with your spare time was your business.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I feel in this that it's like the apples in the barrel. One bad apple spoils the whole barrel in a hurry, and there have been a great many crimes. And I don't know what the motivation is, but basically the statistics do not show that the gun-related crimes are anywhere near as big as the anti-gunners would like you to believe. You compare those statistics with motor vehicle deaths, for example, or alcohol-related deaths, or even drug-related deaths, and they're essentially insignificant. But it's a nice, easy thing to blame. It's something like the political thing. When you've got trouble at home, find a problem, an international problem. I think it's severely oversimplified, and I'm interested to note that there was an anti-gun vote in Washington State recently, and the anti-gunners were just going to eliminate the things as cleanly as they're supposed to be by the Sullivan Act 100 years ago, and almost 100 years ago in New York. And the anti-gunners lost on a 29 to 71% of the vote. And I'll have you notice that is not reported in any newspaper that you or I read. It happened to be an editorial in Wall Street Journal who try to pick up these things. And I think there are people that are stacking the deck. Let's go to work on the alcohol killings, the drug killings, that sort of thing. And if they do eliminate the guns, it'll switch to knives or clubs. A man that's going to kill somebody isn't going to stop because he can't get a pistol.
Right.
And while I'm on this subject, the real effect of the anti-gun, all the work is on the legitimate gun owner. Nobody's ever going to find a way to stop the crooks from getting them unless they are totally unavailable. How many crooks are going to have themselves licensed?
So your father graduated from Syracuse in 1901.
Yeah.
And graduated from the seminary in 1903.
1904.
Did he go right into the seminary?
Yes.
Well, what do you think encouraged him to do that?
Well, he was dedicated. I think he boasted somewhere around age 12 or 14 giving a sermon. He felt the call when he was very young. And there was no doubt about what he was going to do. The only problem was how was he going to manage it, and how would he manage his education? His family were essentially on a survival basis. His mother happened to have a bank account of $300, and when he needed it, she wouldn't let him have it. And with poetic justice, the bank later failed and wiped her out. He had a lot of help. I think he probably had talents. He was certainly a talented person. I don't know how much help he had, but I knew one instance when the chancellor of Syracuse, the equivalent of president in ordinary schools, was talking, I don't know whether just on this subject or not, I don't know. All I remember is that his dad quoted the chancellor said, "Brother Olmstead, I don't see you wearing an overcoat in this weather." And Dad said, "I don't have one." And he pulled out his card and wrote a note on the back of the card, "If you'll go to such and such a store and present this to," I guess he maybe gave him the name of whom to talk to, "and he will take care of it." And he did, and that's how he got an overcoat. I suspect there were a number of other things like that. They had a group of them that were doing something about collective cooking, and I guess they had some boarding house affair. I don't know the whole thing. I never got him to tell that. We bought him a recording machine. We urged him to tell these things, and he was more interested in singing old songs, which, unaccompanied and somewhat off-key, were not as inspiring to the whole family as filling us in on the gaps in the history would have been.
So he was a private man.
I guess. But, well, private, yes. But all of us, if we were good, when we were small enough to get on his lap, we're stuck on his lap the last thing when we were dressed ready for bed before we went to bed, and he'd tell us stories. We had the choice, sort of, usually whether it be religious stories or boyhood stories.
Okay.
And I guess maybe that's still private, but of course we didn't memorize them, we didn't learn them, we didn't have them clear then. We wished that a number of those and some of the gaps could have been filled up by a recording for us for the same sort of reason as you're working.
Hmm. Now, in terms of your schooling, you went to a middle school, correct?
We didn't call them that. Yes. Went through the grades, and they were junior high schools then.
Okay. And then off to high school, where you indicated last time that you experienced times of boredom.
Almost absolute, complete, utter, abysmal boredom, yes.
And why was that again?
Well, that was earlier in the grades, too. In all sorts of situations, rightfully, the teacher had to drill all his students. She wanted to get as many past examinations as she could. And she worked on the ones that didn't need it. And the rest of us were pretty much left to rot. And maybe that's an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it wasn't terribly amusing to hear the slowest student class stumble through things. In some classes in Batavia, the classes were quite large. There are 63 seats in the classroom for each grade in the school I went to. And there we were divided into 2 sections with 2 teachers, and for a teacher for each. And basically that was on pretty much grade standing. So half was slow and half was quick.
Mm-hmm.
That would be 3rd and 4th grade area. And the boredom didn't quite strike then.
What about the 1920s? You were in school at that time, but what was your perception of the 1920s on your family?
That's hard to answer. I was only 16 in 1930, and I wasn't paying much attention to the great wide world, mostly friend and what few friends I had, and of course with moving so often, had to start with a new group of friends each time and sort of sift out which ones had common interests and which ones didn't.
And why were you moving so often again?
It was the system of the church. The general program was to give the pastor, each charge a new pastor roughly every 4 years. There were occasional exceptions that I don't understand. I know one case where it was an 11-year term, not for Dad. But occasionally it would be shorter. There would be a church that had a problem, and either the hierarchy or being Methodist, we had a bishop and a district superintendent supervising all this, where a church had a problem, and a pastor who might be thought to might have a record that would indicate that he might be able to cope with the problem was And of course the church committee would pay for some visits and so on, and if everything was good, or if the bishop said so. The bishop at that time was quite arbitrary. I'm not sure how much attention he paid to anybody, but he'd make a transfer, hoping to solve a problem.
Okay. What about the Depression? What was your perception of the Depression?
I knew it was going on. I didn't see it, really. I always had work in the summers. Admittedly, the first job I had paid 15 cents an hour, but and it was, I don't think that was a full-time job. Well, yes, it was. My first summer work was as a laboratory assistant at the University of Buffalo Medical School, Department of Anatomy, actually through one of Dad's parishioners. And whatever was needed to be done, I was into photography somewhat, and there was a certain amount of slide making. Lantern slides are on glass then, and both the negatives and the positives, and had quite a bit of that to make, lantern slides of sections of books that the professor wished to project. And then there were all these little glass slides that were issued to the students with various sections on them. The gal and my immediate supervisor would do the microtome work and lay the stuff out on the slides, and then it was my job to go through the series of baths that dissolved the wax and stained them, and then cement on the cover glass to finish the slides. And also they had an accumulation there of various bones of their supply of cadavers was the unclaimed bodies of Erie County. And after the students were through using them, they would clean all the flesh off and have the leftover collection of bones. And the very first assignment I went on was to string the finger bones, had been kept in sets, onto wires, the finger and wrist bones, onto piano wire in such a way that they could be slid apart and seen how they fit, and slid together and see how they matched. And it was interesting. The wrist is a very complicated set of bones. I don't remember how many, but just by the way they fit together, you quickly learn where they belong, and I did a great deal of that. Occasionally foot bones, but far more hands and feet. And again, these were issued to the students on a loan basis, I think, to help them understand what they're going to have to face. Just a whole variety of assignments like that. And the whole summer, all of 15 cents an hour.
So you didn't really personally experience the effects of the Depression?
No. Dad paid my college bills. Got a few pennies out of this too. Of course, I was living with the family or keeping house for them when they were on vacation. The other summers, I had 2 summers. Another one of Dad's parishioners was the fellow that handled the fuel and lubrication end of Larkin, which is one of those from poverty to poverty in 3 generations outfits. It was a big store. They had a mail order and door-to-door business. And they also had a few gas stations around Buffalo. And the next summers I had part-time work at Larkin's. The first summer was down on Seneca Street. Again, several of us, the man in charge sort of spread his, took in a number of people that would be helped appreciate having part-time work. None of us really had full-time work. For my first summer, I was at Seneca Street a few days a week, and then joined my family out at their camp in Canadice Lake. And the second summer was a few days a week up at Seneca Street. At that time, I lived in Buffalo, and had an interesting time working the best way to commute from my place of residence to the Main Street station. First summer was as a gasoline pumper and windshield wiper, that sort of thing. The second summer was in a grease pit. And then I kind of lost track of the summers, but one summer Lackawanna Steel, division of Bethlehem Steel, had opened what was the world's second largest so-called strip mill, where they converted ingots into sheet steel, 6 feet wide and of any length desired. And I worked there part of the summer. There, that was all the employment there. They had to man the whole mill, and there I don't think there was any unemployment problem in Lackawanna that summer. And then I went back to took 2 courses in summer school to get myself. Well, I'd gone there as a transfer student, and they allowed me to be a sort of between the sophomore and junior, and I picked up 2 more courses so that I was a full qualified senior for the second year.
This is a senior in college or high school?
Neither one. This is a technical school, MIT.
Oh, this is at MIT?
Yeah.
Okay. You went to Allegheny College for?
4 years.
4 years.
Class of 35.
And then went straight to MIT?
As a transfer student. And in 2 years I had a second bachelor's degree.
So these were jobs that you had in the summertime, and in the fall, winter, and spring, you were enrolled?
Yes.
In school?
Yes. Okay. And at Allegheny, my last 2 years, I had a student assistantship in physics that took care of tuition. Well, I got a discount. Allegheny was more Methodist related then than it is now. It still is, but I don't know, maybe pastors' kids get a $100 dish or more. Then the tuition was $300, and because of my class rank, they took off 100 for my regents grades and 100 for being preacher's kid, and so my first year tuition was $100. The second year tuition was $200. That totals up to being 1 year worth. In the last 2 years, I earned it. And at MIT, when I finished, got my bachelor's, I had a scholarship for tuition for a graduate year. So again, no tuition for my master's degree.
And your master's degree was in what?
Also mechanical engineering. We had master engineering was divided into various options, and mine was the automotive option. I had a love affair with the internal combustion engine then that hasn't altogether disappeared. And those summers, one was in the steel mill between sophomore, junior, and senior, and the next summer was at Wright Aeronautical Corporation, the grinding room for the summer. And then when the third summer came along, I was a graduate, and the Wright Aeronautical hired me as a trainee.
Was it common for young men to have a summer job between schooling years?
Yeah.
And it was most of the time directed towards, or it referred to their area of expertise?
I don't know. I can't say that clearly. All I know is really my own. A fellow who was the state historian until he died, Bill Hunter, was a college Allegheny acquaintance. And one of his summers, he bummed his ride out to, I believe, Idaho, and worked on a sheep ranch. I don't know how much he made at it. I don't know what probably got his living out of it. He was sort of bitter about the song Home on the Range. It didn't really quite apply to his experiences. I guess the main thing, I never did any of it, but the main thing that you folks may not realize today is how much bumming there was done on both automobile and railroad.
What do you mean by bumming?
Hitching a ride.
Oh, okay.
Freight trains often ran slowly enough that people could swing on, given the right place to do it. And boxcars usually had open doors when they were unloaded. Who could take the time and effort to close the door behind them, as with even in houses. And people would go over. Very, very few. The riding underneath the car was known as riding the rods. And I don't know how much that was done, except maybe by professional hobos. Most of my acquaintances are just out thumbing rides and stand beside the road and thumb a ride. A very dear friend traveled all over the country by use of his thumb.
And that was common?
Very common.
For young men to even travel all over, just because it was easy?
Well, most had specific destinations, but I can't say how common. I know the people that did it.
Did you never experienced?
Only did it once. I hitched a ride home for one time, and then came back by a interurban streetcar line, which has also disappeared.
Would you say that a college education was popular in the 1930s?
No, no, I can't give you the figures. I always figure that, well, maybe 80 to 90% got through high school, and maybe 5% got to college, and maybe 0.5% got graduate degrees. I don't know whether that's a good figure or not, but, and if you ask me the same question tomorrow, I might give you different percentages, but.
So the majority of young men out of high school went into the workforce?
Yes.
What were some of the more common jobs?
Well, gas station attendants soaked up the people interested in that sort of thing. In some states, I guess it still is illegal in Jersey, pumping your own gas was not frowned upon before the automatic nozzles came along. Mm-hmm. And any gas station had to have enough people to handle whatever trade came in. Construction jobs. There was a lot of highway construction. One of my good high school friends' father was a contractor, and he went out and did whatever needed done, and this is highway construction, their highway construction. He drove trucks, and the truck needed driving. You ran the shovel, and the shovel needed a man on it, and there were maybe a lunch break for the regular man or something like that. There was an enormous variety of things of this sort.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I know one fellow during the Depression that he really wasn't working. He kind of volunteered on one of the main 2-foot railroad gauges for the summer. Mm. In fact, they let him, they were willing to have him along. Nobody was paying attention. He didn't get anything for it, but his comment is that's the summer he lived on bologna sandwiches. Hmm. I don't know where he lived. I don't know any of the detail for that, but there were a small number of very, very tiny railroad, 2-foot gauge. That's as small as they come. And they were on their last legs during the Depression, but if a fella comes along and volunteers to help and nobody's going to arrest him for doing it, they're going to accept the help of sorts in various ways. But beyond that, I just don't know. Of course, there were all temporary clerking jobs in stores and elsewhere. I think the generality is that things were vastly more labor-intensive then than they are now. That high wages have forced mechanization that wasn't going to come without it.
What were your impressions of President Roosevelt after the Depression?
After the Depression, or after it started, after all, Depression came in, he was pretty much entered just before the real bottom of the Depression.
Do you think he helped bring the United States out of it?
I was not rational on that subject. He was a New York Stater, and so was I. He entered office in New York State with an abundant surplus and ran the state into debt. Mm. We from New York sort of felt he was going to do the same thing to the nation. you didn't have to read the papers much to pick up the papers that were opposed to him, that he discussed with Hoover a number of things and professed not to like them. But then when he came in, and I think he even spoke against them in his campaigning, but when he came in, proceeded to inaugurate a number of the changes that Hoover had suggested. We thought of him as very much as a politician first and above all.
And when you say we, you mean the New York Staters?
Well, I can't speak for the circle in which I was involved.
Okay. So when you graduated from MIT, you entered the workforce?
Yes.
Or were recruited into the workforce?
Yes.
Okay, and that was by whom? Wright Aeronautical?
Wright Aeronautical Corporation.
Okay.
Recruiting was quite active there. I can't tell you, but one of the differences between Allegheny and MIT, the Allegheny Corps, most people were going into graduate. A lot of pre-medicals were there, and pre-law, and pre-something or other. They were working off their academic credentials before entering their profession. And there was, so far as I know, there was no formal job placement program. At MIT, we had a very aggressive job placement program, and arrangements were made. In fact, even though I was going to work for Wright during the summer between bachelor's and graduate year, I, just for the practice, went through some of the interviews available, and a number of interesting interviews were there. General Electric was pretty much number one. They had a personable guy that was just there for a long period of time, and I think just about everybody in the class had a invitation to apply from General Electric. I don't remember any other. None of the automotive firms called on us. I don't know why. But, I remember one year Hoover Vacuum Cleaner was there. Oh, yes, and a number of the Connecticut heavy industries. A little sluggish in thinking of the names, but the group of the people around Ansonia and that area in Connecticut were up. Oh yeah, Farrell Birmingham's the name I'm trying to think of. That are heavy industrial machinery for many of the process industries.
And for how long did you work for Wright Aeronautical?
Either 1 year or two. I'm not, 47 for 2 years.
And briefly, what did you do there?
Well, I'd done my master's gear on a thesis on the dynamics of aircraft overhead valve gear.
Okay.
They turned over a Pratt & Whitney Wasp that had been done, and I disassembled it so that only one cylinder was connected, and studied the performance of valve gear they knew they were prone to jumping, but they didn't know all the details, and this was a study at various speeds of what the valve actually did. In fact, my professor and I then published that paper in the paper, first publication I ever did in the Journal of Aeronautical Sciences, presented in an annual meeting, and they published it.
And from Wright?
At school. So Wright wanted a repetition of the same information for their own valve gear. And so I repeated what I'd done for, it was several months at Wright, giving them a set of curves for their valve gear at various speeds and conditions. And then when that was done, I went on the carburetor test stand and was on that for, well, let's see, is that right? I think 3 years, 39 to, no, right, I'm sorry, right, it was 37 to 41. 2 years, I was a year and a half on carburation. And then I went to Oklahoma in 39 and stayed there until the oil industry, till the draft came along and the oil industry was not essential. And that would have been the February of 41. Essentially 2 years again.
So as a mechanical engineer at Wells Surveys, what did you do?
They had developed a process of using natural radioactivity, actually gamma radiation, in oil wells, and they knew that, well, maybe they didn't know, but they were learning that ordinary rock, in that case mostly limestone, had intermediate radiation, that sandstone had very low radiation, and that shale had high radioactivity. And so, by running an instrument down an existing hole, and no amount of casing or concrete affected the gamma ray penetration, or didn't affect it enough to, we could give a trace of, from which you could tell what was outside the hole, whether it was limestone or basically rock, essential limestone, shale, or sandstone. And it was always profitable to explore the sandstone to see whether it might be an oil sand. And for reasons that are a long, long story, a number of the pools in Oklahoma were drilled at a time. Well, I'll have to give you a word or two of description here. The original drilling method was cable tool, so-called, where you have a appropriate, really a chisel, and just pick it up and drop it, and pick it up and drop it, and chips the stuff away. And then they have to pull that out, that is on a cable, and pull that out and send a baler down to pick up the chips, and then drop the tool down and do some more. And that was always done in to keep the thing from collapsing. They always had to case that. That was always done in a cased hole. and very tedious and very expensive, and that had limits. After you have part of the hole cased, obviously the next hole has to be smaller so you can case that. So they start with the big hole casing and case down, and eventually get to the point where there's no room left for the tool. In fact, the working depth, I don't know when they did it. I think it was while I was there, but cable tool holes were stretched to get to 6,000 feet. In fact, in Oklahoma City, they got down to a few hundred feet of a producing horizon, Chattanooga shale in that case, and couldn't quite make it. And so the area that became gushers when they changed the method, they didn't even find with cable tools. Again, I don't know how much of this is really part of your story, but anyhow, my background. Then somebody invented the rotary rig, in which you went in with a rotary cutter of various kinds. The simplest one would be just a simple little fishtail thing that would dig up. And rotary hole is always done with pipe. You circulate a cooling fluid or a fluid to carry out the chips around the outside, and the chips come floating up. Around the inside, down the inside, and the chips come up around the outside with the fluid, and you put them in a settling basin and take the water out and recycle the water, free of essentially the bigger chips. It's known as mud, however, and looks like it. And the cable tool has the advantage that you have this rotating pipe above it, and it's constantly massaging the surface of the hole, and even anything that isn't quite just plain wet dirt, it keeps your hole open, and you can go to tremendous depths. And not quite as simple as that, but anyhow, cable tools, rotary holes, in my day were common at 12,000 feet. I think they now go to practically 20. It's the only way you can get a deep hole that I know of. And first, when they started drilling, they were working in pools that had been cable tool pools before. There's some pools around Oklahoma, right around Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And in their greed, everybody did everything he could to drill a hole as fast as he could. Of course, you can speed it along by putting extra weight on this cable rig. There are ways of doing it. And those pools were such a mess that frequently they go right through a producing horizon and not know about it. The structure underneath is badly faulted, and it isn't one pool of oil at one depth. It's a number of pools of oil at different depths. And if they thought the proper depth to go, had the notion what the proper depth to go to, they just hurried up and got there. I think I mentioned to you before that in my case, I went out with the rigs when they first went out. Ran them the first time myself to check them out. And one well I worked on was a dry hole in one of these pools. We located a producing horizon part way down, and when they blew off the casing, it was a bigger well than it ever had been originally. But that's sort of a special case, that there weren't an unlimited number of those, and I haven't the slightest idea what's happened to that end of the business since. And I was designing, we had two electrical groups and mechanical groups. The electrical groups were designing all the circuitry and the electrical equipment and that sort of thing to transfer the signal from the ionization chamber that was hanging at the bottom
Mm-hmm.
up to equipment that could record it on a chart. And I got the mechanical jobs. Mechanical job of the proper winch, truck winch, to handle the special cable we had. It wasn't a routine cable, it was a coaxial cable, relatively delicate, and took careful handling. And a measuring wheel so that we knew the depth of the tool, and a Selson system to tie the measuring wheel rotation into a little Selson in the recorder so that the chart was keeping track of the tool location. And the electricals came up with some funny designs on equipment to hold their electrical stuff, and I wound up designing the chassis for them to stick electrical things on to go inside a piece of pipe. And the details, the ionization chambering, the thickness and threading arrangements and gasketing and sealing and getting in and out and all the rest all came under my responsibility.
So, at Wells Surveys, you were specifically dealing with radiation and oil wells.
Yeah, I was the one dealing with the radiation. The instruments did that.
Mm-hmm.
I was dealing with the mechanical equipment to enable the survey to be made, and the other team of 3 people was on a much larger assignment of getting electrical equipment that would pick up a signal in a ionization chamber 9,000 feet away. Actually, down on, I think it was on the end of 15,000 feet of cable, and translate it into a motion and a pen on a moving chart. And their problems were the bigger ones.
So for how long did you work for Wells Surveys?
Let's see, I got it worked out. I came there in 39, 2 years.
And in 1941, where did you move on to?
Linden, New Jersey, Lawrence Aeronautical Corporation.
Are you married at this time?
I got married at Lawrence. And incidentally, Lawrence is spelled R-A-N-C-E. For Charles Lanier Lawrence, who was the president and essential owner of the place, who was the man that is well known in the aviation industry for bringing the radial engine to America.
So at your new job in 1941, you were again dealing with engines?
This got back to engines. I was a project engineer. They had a line of 2-cylinder 5-kilowatt generators that were for the PT boats and for the some of the flying boats, such as the Catalina. I went there just as they were accumulating the parts to make their 5-cylinder radial engine. The generator wasn't much bigger, but it was intended to give 5 kilowatts at 18,000 feet. And I was test engineer on the 5-cylinder engines. And then eventually I went through the ranks. I eventually became chief experimental engineer and then project engineer until I left in 44.
At this time, from 1941 to 1944, did your firm have a relationship with the government?
Yes, it was exclusively government. In fact, for a while there, we had a higher priority than the airplanes in which we were going to go. I don't know how it happened. The whole business of setting priorities was a strange thing.
Mm.
And one of the things that got me, they started out with a neat system of A, B, C. I don't know how far it might have gone. And then as everything, new projects came along, they had double A and triple A, and heaven knows how many, just the number of A's are what counted.
Mm.
And I think we had a double A when, I don't remember the particular, but I think we had a double A when the airplanes had single A.
Mm. So the Warriors...
And I don't know whether it was really determined by a hard fact or whether it was somebody used a two-headed nickel. I haven't the slightest idea what the, I think it was the APB, the American Priority Board, was the, I think, the outfit that set priorities. We didn't have much trouble with procurement of whatever we wanted. We could pretty much get, so far as I was concerned. There are jobs where we wanted various instruments, and we got them. For determining engine vibration and things like that, we often need electronic equipment. And whenever I could prove that demonstrate that I needed something from General Radio Corporation, they bought it, and we got it.
So you experienced a lot of accommodating relationships within the firm and with the government as well?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I didn't have anything to do with the government end of it. Well, yes, I did. I had to get out to Wright Field once in a while and discuss our project with the project engineer there that was in charge of the Army work. And our Navy work was out of Washington or Philadelphia Navy Yard, occasional trip there. But mostly in engines. Nobody could then design a foolproof engine. You had to do things however conservative you wanted to, do the best you could, capitalize on all the experience you had, and then actually run them and encounter a number of little surprises.
Hmm.
And they did some stupid things. Every automobile I ever knew, where the rocker arm touched the valve, just let it slide. It's all bathed in oil. What the heck? For some reason or other, well, the big aircraft engines had a rocker arm with a roller on the end. At Lawrence, they chose to have a little screw. Oh yeah, and of course it has to be adjustable there, just the valve clearance. At Lawrence, they had a little screw, and they took an ordinary bearing ball and ground a flat on that to give a flat surface to bear against here. Well, if the valve jumped under any occasion, often the ball would turn, so you had the ball instead of the flat against there, and that didn't let the valve close, and you had problems. I, for one, considered that thing pretty darn stupid anyhow, and eventually reached the point of machining a ball to make on a screw machine and having a little foot-like on one side, so it had a big flat that would keep the screw from swallowing the thing and supposedly against the valve. And that gave a certain amount of trouble, and was expensive to make and a nuisance. And I watched that for about so long, and I insisted, I went on pretty much on my own. They were very closely controlled. We didn't really have much initiative allowed to us, but anyhow, I took the screw and had them put a spherical radius on the bottom and harden the surface, and that worked just as well as everything else did, and it was cheaper than anything else and caused no troubles. I felt that's the way it should have been designed in the first place. But we were all close-knit, a fairly small group, and we all worked together and thrashed out our problems and argued them out, and you win some and you lose some.
What do you think were your greatest concerns at this time, professionally?
Are you thinking about Lawrence Aeronautical, or are you thinking about my career?
Well, at this time, during the war, in terms of your career, the types of things you worried about?
I didn't fret at all about my career. I was busy. I didn't have time to worry about those things. There was a constant succession of technical problems at Lawrence. And the draftsmen showed signs of amateurism. They were trained draftsmen, they didn't have engine experience. And I don't know if any of them had ever put an engine together. Sometimes there's enormous isolation from drafting room to practice. Since those days I've encountered that. I have purchased machinery that was supposed to have, the drafting room had left it so that you couldn't put a wrench on the bolts that they had holding it together. Just completely stupid things. I just didn't leave clearance for wrenches. Or one fellow had an oil arrangement where you had to screw in an elbow fitting to make it work, and there wasn't clearance for the elbow fitting. Well, I just dismiss as typical drafting room errors. These guys are in an isolated position there. They haven't had any hands-on experience. We had a dose of that. Our two larger engines that I eventually wound up as a project engineer on both, the two Navy engines, both had a perfectly standard gear-type oil pump, same as on most automobiles, except for one in the Chrysler line, and it worked, and it was no problem. When they designed the Army engine, I don't really know what the motivation, maybe they're going to save space, but instead of a gear pump, they put in a vane pump. And they did not recognize how weak it was, and those pumps kept breaking. And when they broke to the engine running, the engine was wrecked before they could shut them down. And it just put us and the Army was mad because we weren't giving them engines for their B-29s. And eventually they canceled the contract on us, and really that was the reason I left. Because I just, having watched that floundering, I figured the firm couldn't last 6 months. Well, it did. It lasted a year.
So in 1944 you moved on to what firm?
Cleveland, Jack and Heinz.
Again, with experience in engines or otherwise?
No, there I got miscellaneous assignments. I did do some work on the engines they were trying to develop, but whatever came along was part of it. Here was a much larger organization, and actually when I was there, it was bigger than Wright had been when I was there. We had several thousand of us in an engineering department of maybe 40 draftsmen and maybe 15 engineers, 15 project engineers. Essentially, I was the last man hired in the department, and I wound up on an assortment of assignments. One that was kind of fun is that an expert at Westinghouse, the name of Wall, a very famous name, and he was involved in a number of things. I don't know how many. He's obviously a group leader of some sort. Wrote an article about the problems they had making fittings to hold generators onto accessory pads on engines that vibrated. Well, meanwhile, Jack and Heinz had developed those were steel forgings and quite heavy, and as generators got bigger, they didn't work, and they resonated, and they had all kinds of problems. And Ralph Heinz was, I think, one of the cleverest designers I ever knew, and he worked how to do the job for about 5 pounds in magnesium instead of about 15 pounds in forged steel, high analysis forged steel, and develop a mount for the generator that was far stronger than the engine pad was. And one of my jobs was to take a couple of these generators to Pratt & Whitney for a couple of weeks, where they had a testing machine that vibrated to see what things were. And our generator was the stiffest thing they'd ever had on there, and they couldn't make it resonate in any way. And sat there and listened to this darn machine howl at us for a while and doing nothing, and nothing happened. And eventually they gave up and decided this was strong enough and no problem. And, well, in one of the journals, I think it was Machine Design, Wall did an article on the problems of the spool piece to hold generators onto engines. And they asked me to write an article and rebuttal. It was kind of fun, twisting the expert's tail. I wrote a 3-page article for them, or a three-paragraph article for them, outlining the problems and how new and flamboyant Jack and Heinz like to take a different approach to problems once in a while. Sometimes we turn the problems inside out and so on, and came up with solutions. And in that recounted how many pounds that our thing had saved, and that we'd put the frequency way above anything that an engine could develop, just really by using our heads and not doing the way that it had always been done. That was kind of fun to see that in print. Ralph Heinz wanted to review it. He changed one word. I think he was right. I used an as instead of a like, I think, and he corrected me. And there were an assortment of things like this. We were trying to work on the accessory engine. We took a Franklin 4-cylinder engine, and we're building making an engine generator set out, same thing I worked at it, except much bigger. This was 100 horsepower instead of 15, and we're working on a 400 cycle generator, I think of 40 kilowatts or something like that, for the Flying Wing, whose, I'll think of the name. engines go inside the wing and furnish electrical power for it. And the fan that they had proposed was our fan, although it was Franklin's engine, didn't begin to cool the engine. And so they dumped the job on my lap to figure out a fan arrangement and housing for the fan that would. And we made a bunch of fans, and they gave me a test stand to work on. And there's quite a bit of analysis for that. I'd had a little bit of fan experience. We had a fan cooling problem at Lawrence that I could profit by. And eventually, and that's one of the closest scrapes of my life. I didn't have any idea, although we'd never really studied how much heat rejection an engine makes. So I assumed that it was wasting in heat 1 horsepower for every horsepower the engine was delivering. And then I also had nothing to go to that I knew of to tell me how much temperature you could put into the air from the fins on the engine. Again, it was just a guess. And I hoped that it could pick up 100 degrees. Well, the fates were with me. Both were wrong. And it turned out that the heat rejection was 65 hundredths of a horsepower, and that the temperature picked up was 65 degrees. And so it worked just like I'd intended it that way. And that was one of the happiest days of my life that thing worked out.
So you worked at Jack and Heinz until 1947.
Yeah.
And at that point you came to Carlisle.
Yep.
And you were working for your father-in-law.
Yep.
Could you tell me a little bit about your wife, your marriage, and any children?
Yeah. The daughter of one of Dad's friends in Genesee Conference and I were in Allegheny together. I had met her beforehand. We crossed paths once. I frequently went on, nothing else to go on trips with Dad. They were going to a conference meeting or something, and often she was with her father, and we just knew each other very casually. I knew her name and not much else. We were in Allegheny together, and we were both pretty busy. We dated a few times with that, maybe a few, half a dozen times. And then I liked her very much, but holy smoke, she was president of student government and involved in all sorts of things. I didn't know if she ever had any time. I never really found out any. And in fact, I don't think she ever went to any of the dances I did. I don't know whether invitation or time or whatnot. And then after school, for a while, her family was living in Kenmore while I was living in Buffalo. So I saw her once in a while in Kenmore. And we dated more than we had one time in particular. We were going to go to a movie, and her sister saw her putting on a hat. She said, "Edith, you're not going to wear that hat." And she says, "Why not?" She says, "Ed's seen it for 4 years through college. Why not?" And just that sort of a girl, we got along well. And then this is while I wasn't I was in graduate school by then. I just had a chance to see her maybe once in a while, and I didn't take anything seriously. And eventually, and we always wrote one letter a year. And the strange thing was how many times the letter was written the same night. I can't explain this at all. And eventually, she went in, she decided to go into medicine, and was, our letters crossed someplace, or I don't know where. She wrote a letter to me in Oklahoma after I'd left. It was forwarded to me. And I wrote her a letter in Kenmore, and it was forwarded to Northampton. And it turned out she was doing some graduate work at Smith. I guess probably picking up some stuff in order to go into medical school. I don't know. But her letter included the comment that if you ever want to see Smith, you better hurry up because I'm leaving at the end of this term. This year. And so my quick reply was, I'm about 200 miles away in Linden, New Jersey. You name the time and I'll be there. And she invited me up for their spring dance, which was in March in Northampton, and in 8 inches of snow. And a friend of mine was going up skiing, so he drove me up. We arrived there in the middle of the night, and I didn't know where to go. I went in the only hotel they had, and then next morning I caught her where I was supposed to, and she had a room, a private room, or living with somebody or other, an acquaintance, and there were 3 of us boys there, and we chatted all day, and then showered and dressed and went to the dance that evening. Oh yeah, and I was over to visit her, and she was, I don't know the proper name. In our freshman dormitory, they were called proctors for the sections of the dormitory, and I guess I'd call her a proctor of a small cooperative house that was associated, it was a satellite for one of the big girls' dormitories. This was a little place. I think there were 12 girls there who were cooperative work. They were getting some of their own meals. I guess their main meals were right over the main dormitory, and doing their own laundry and making their own beds and cleaning their own house and that sort of thing, and given a break on the cost for doing it. There was another one next door, and she had taken an enormous shine to the gal in charge of the one next door. In fact, when I was killing time Saturday afternoon, the gal next door showed up, and the 3 of us chatted in her living room, and I was quite impressed. And here was a gal. It worked out she had been a full scholarship at Smith. I think probably for her grad, she had a master's degree. She was also in the same class as we were, had a master's degree, and had taught school for a while, first down in a satellite to one of the Philadelphia colleges, a girls' school that doesn't exist anymore. She insists I got it found, but it's ancient history what the name was. And then she was several years at Salem Academy in Winston-Salem. And she had decided to go for, and her grandfather had said he'd pay for her doctorate. So she went back to Smith and worked some and got a bunch of the doctorate stuff worked out. And then her field was South American history, and she liked what was available in Columbia better than what was at Smith, and was transferring to Columbia. Well, it turned out that evening that the two of them had more dances exchanged with me than anybody else, and I just, I liked what I saw. Even then I realized here's one of the smartest person I'd ever known in my life. She was just keen and brilliant. And when she said she was coming to Smith, and I found, or no, Columbia, I was 10 miles outside of the city, and well, my sister's place was. I was further away. I saw to it there was a letter waiting for her when she checked into Johnson Hall on 116th Street. Mm-hmm. And then I had an awful time competing with Martinique. She was trying to do a paper on Martinique, but we did squeeze in a few days that autumn. Actually, my brother-in-law and sister and helped me. I guess our first date was to go to see My Sister Eileen, a comedy, and mm-hmm. Okay. And then also we another date was to take her to Frederick Lawton in Mutiny on the Bounty. That's a joke that we've had. I was just delighted. Here's a gal I hardly knew and perfectly willing to hold hands during the movie. Some 15 years later, she told her daughters that was so she could keep track of where they were. Well, just a tremendous sense of humor, and I just like, and we went on a few picnics together and so on. Basically, we had, up to the time I started to tell you, we had 10 or 11 dates together in the whole autumn. Mm-hmm. And then we had found, we kind of liked exploring the smorgasbords around New York. And we had picked out one we kind of liked the best, which happened to be the Castle Home. Two of them were homes, I forget. There were three of them that we tried out. We liked the Castle Home. And to be precise about it, on Friday evening, December 5th, 1941, I darn near killed myself. I drove over and picked her up. And one place in Jersey, I was boiling around at legal speed and went under a railroad pass, and it was solid fog on the other line. 2 lanes of cars, and I managed to get in. There was nobody in the middle lane, and I squealed to a stop and then found my way into my lane and inched my way into New York after that. She knew about the fog and wondered whether it was going to show up. I didn't. I hadn't any warning until I came there. We went to the Castle Home, and almost to ourselves, I was surprised. The other time we'd been there, and we ate till we could eat no more and danced till we could dance no more, and at an indecent hour of the evening, I took her back to her dormitory and then back over to my brother-in-law's place and climbed in his car and drove up to Rochester during the rest of the night. To my parents, and the next morning we helped my father pick out a new car and traded my brother-in-law's old car on my father's new car, and transferred my father's old car to my brother-in-law. And then Mother fed us a little. We caught a little bit of a nap and started back toward New York. Well, my sister had seen enough of this gal that she took a tremendous shine to her. She thought I'd never found anybody quite that good before. and she invited her to come out to Jersey and wait for the boys. So she did, and came out by train. The Erie came off, and the station was a mile from Sis's place, and when she phoned Sis at a reasonable, I don't know, it might have been as late as 9 o'clock on Sunday, December 7th, a little surprised when I answered the phone. We'd driven all night and got back.
Mm-hmm.
We four always had fun together, and we had a good time all day. And at dinner, Sis fed us a meal, and then the young lady announced she was going to go back to New York the way she'd come. And I announced she wasn't, because 116th Street had Morningside Park just a block or so away from where Johnson Hall was. And Morningside Park in 1941 had the same reputation that all of New York does now. This is a place to get mugged and whatnot. And I didn't like the idea of her taking a subway and having to walk a couple of blocks. Whichever subway she took, she had two choices, I think, to get to Johnson Hall. And so, knowing that I'd had very little sleep for 2 nights, I had 2 cups of black coffee. Well, I've been afraid of that damn stuff ever since. She succumbed to superior argument, and I drove her in, and somewhere along the way, I haven't the slightest idea. Didn't have any trouble. We didn't run any lights or get pinched or do anything we shouldn't. I guess we took the ferry over. I usually did. After all, that was only a quarter, and the tunnel was 50 cents. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the way, before we got to the ferry, what I remember best is suddenly coming to with a sort of a start and saying, "Hey, you idiot, you are halfway through a proposal and you can't stop now." Well, there was quite a bit of discussion about this. She, of course, knew about the other girl and wanted to know all about my relationship there and so on and so on and so on. But before I left for home that night, she'd said yes. Huh. And our family joke ever since has been, I don't dare trust that stimulate and brew. I do all sorts of rash and impetuous things I never would have gotten around to otherwise. And then we married March 21st, and before we were involved in the war. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait a minute. Before we were really bearing down, yeah, that had been Pearl Harbor Day, so sure, this after the war started, but all the restrictions didn't come on. We had enough gas to honeymoon down at St. Simon's Island in March and get back and get to work.
Any children?
Yeah. Every odd year in the spring. I had another daughter.
How many?
3.
3 daughters.
43, 45, and 47.
And so by 47, was your 3rd daughter born by the time you came to Carlisle?
We brought her here in a basket.
Brought her.
She was 2 months old.
And this was at the time when you now have left Jack and Heights.
Yeah.
And are working for your father-in-law.
Yeah.
At the paper mill.
Yeah. Call it Eaton Dykeman Corporation. Or the Eaton Dykeman Company, actually.
What was your job description at Eaton Dykeman?
Job description we'd argued about, didn't know quite what, we didn't argue, we just discussed a mechanical engineer. Mm-hmm. That doesn't say much.
What did your job involve you doing?
Mostly what was so obvious to me that needed doing that we hardly had time to prioritize it. I basically, I did what I saw needed doing. My father-in-law said yes.
What were these types of things?
Well, one of the first ones, he recognized that some strange changes had been made on the sprinkler system for one reason or another. And one of the first ones was I took all the, partly to get familiar with the mill, but all of the drawings from the various sprinkler things, went around and examined everything and saw everything I could that wasn't good. And where we had changes needed in the sprinkler system, where we had left wood in when there's forms when it shouldn't have been left in, where the coverage was bad, where sprinklers were in the way and needed things and so on. And then since the mill had burned to the ground 4733, 14 years previously, in this trip, it looked to me as though the people that had let a mill burn to the ground before were fixing to do the same thing again, and I took on aggressive fire protection.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, a lot of other things, the working places for the so-called finishing operations, the aisles happened to be where nobody had yet put anything.